In this presentation, we'll look at the common tone resolutions of some chromatic harmonies. First, we'll talk a little bit about prolongation. There are many ways to prolong or embellish a harmony, that is, to make its presence felt as a controlling musical force, even when that harmony is not being expressly stated. For instance, the dominant could be prolonged through a pedal tone on scale degree 5, as we might see in the retransition of a sonata form. Another means might be to provide a contrasting chord, which intervenes between statements of the prolonged harmony. Let's consider, for instance, the key of C major, and we'll go from a statement of a C major chord to a 4-6-4 chord and back to C major. This is particularly good at prolonging because we see that common tones are kept. C, E, G, C, F, A, then back to C, E, G. So we see a common tone being kept with the C's, and everything else is moving by step. That's a nice way of prolonging that C major harmony with a contrasting chord. In the above circumstances, we see a diatonic common tone resolution. A chord is resolved by keeping its common tone. However, it's also possible and quite interesting to have chromatic chords resolving by common tone. So let's talk about some principles of common tone resolution. The guiding principle of common tone resolution is that, obviously, a common tone must be maintained between the two different harmonies. Most often, in the following cases, we will see a common tone maintained between three harmonies. We'll have two different chords, but three different statements. Just like we saw in 1-4-6-4-1, we'll have three chords with a common tone between each of them, with usually the outer chords being the same. This common tone will help particularly in certain chromatic progressions, where the chromatic chord seems to resolve, quote-unquote, incorrectly. Other voices in the chordal progression will tend to, but not always, move by step. So we'll have some tones that are kept in place as common tones, and other ones that will move by step. The most common harmonies that we'll see to have common tone resolutions will be fully diminished seventh chords and augmented sixth chords. Let's take a look at an example of common tone diminished sevenths. Common tone diminished sevenths, or as I'll abbreviate them, and I recommend that you do too in your analysis, CT diminished seventh, will typically occur between two statements of the same harmony. So we'll have two statements of a chord with a common tone diminished seventh in the middle. They are analyzed as CT diminished seven because their resolution is non-normative. In other words, we're not going to say it's 7 diminished of whatever, because oftentimes it's not functioning that way. So giving it a different label is going to help us understand how it's being used in the music. Let's consider, for instance, this excerpt from Beethoven's Piano Sonata Opus 53 in C major, the Waldstein. Here, a 5 chord is stated in the first measure of the excerpt. Then we hear these G's continuing that 5. We then hear C sharp, G, and B flat, which would be a 7 diminished 4-3 of 2, with the third being omitted. And we see this resolving to a 5-6 at the beginning of the third measure. Note here that that 7 fully diminished 4-3 of 2 does not function as a fully diminished 7 of 2. It does not resolve to the supertonic. Instead, it appears to elaborate that 5 chord, emphasizing the final arrival on it, without actually taking us away from it, because we have that prominent common tone holding everything together. It's just that elaboration of it. Therefore, rather than analyzing it as 5, 7 fully diminished 4-3 of 2, and then 5-6, it is preferable to analyze that fully diminished 7 as a common tone diminished seventh, because that is how it is functioning. Not as something that wants to resolve to 2, but something that is prolonging 5 by having the common tone kept, having additional pitches that come in, the B flat and C sharp, that each then resolve up a step to G major. Though most appearances of common tone resolution involve an intervening chord between two statements of the same harmony, as we observed before in 5, common tone diminished 7th 5, there are indeed other possibilities. For instance, it is possible to simply resolve a diminished 7th by means of keeping a common tone and moving to a chord other than the chord that preceded it. So we'll consider this passage below. Here we have a 1 chord. You could analyze it as a 6 chord, but if you consider the B flat as the root, but it could also be heard as a 1 chord with an appoggiatura, that B flat acting as an appoggiatura. Then we move on to a 7 fully diminished 7 of 6, A, E flat, and G flat with a D flat pedal. So that chord usually would want to resolve to B flat minor, which in this case is 6 in Chopin's D flat major nocturne. And then lastly, we have a 2-4-2 in the third measure. So looking at the left hand, we move from 1 to 7 diminished 7 of 6 to 2-4-2. That 7 diminished 7 of 6 does not resolve correctly. It should resolve here to 6. Instead, we misresolve it to that 2-4-2. So it would be more likely to consider it something else rather than a 7 fully diminished 7 of 6. And indeed, if we pay close attention, we see that there are 2 common tones that are kept, the G flat and the E flat. In fact, we can hear those in the way that Chopin voice leads this, starting in the second measure. We hear the G flat and the E flat remain the same. It's only the A natural that changes. So it would be more appropriate in this circumstance, instead of analyzing that as a 7 fully diminished 7 of 6, to analyze it as a common tone diminished 7. Common tone augmented sixth chords will follow the same principles as common tone fully diminished sevenths. Note that they will typically embellish a chord, that is, they'll intervene between 2 statements of the same chord. And they won't resolve in the typical way that one expects. Rather, they'll keep a common tone with other notes moving by step. We see one such example in Schubert's Am Meer. Note the first harmony, which is a Swiss augmented sixth chord, that is, an enharmonic spelling of a German augmented sixth. Here we have A, F natural, A, B sharp, D sharp, and A. We should note that this comes in an atypical inversion with an A in the bass. This should then proceed, as we would expect, to a cadential 6-4, a 5, and then a 1. However, he moves directly to a 1 chord and then back to a Swiss augmented sixth. And we shouldn't miss the fact that we have A's in the outer voices that are kept as prominent common tones. And we also shouldn't miss that everything else is moving by step. The F moves down to an E, the B sharp up to a C sharp, the D sharp up to an E. So, because of this, the fact that we have a prominent common tone, the fact that everything else moves by step, and the fact that these chords are not resolving the way that we expect them to, suggests that rather than counting these as Swiss augmented sixths, we should instead count them as common tone augmented sixths instead. To review, resolution by means of common tone provides an excellent way to prolong a harmony or provide a novel harmonic progression. Resolving chromatic chords by means of a common tone, particularly the fully diminished seventh and augmented sixth chords, was one possible harmonic technique in the 19th century. In these resolutions, a common tone was kept between the chromatic harmony and the chord it was resolved to, with most other voices resolving by step.